Hello, Artistry 2. I hope everyone is doing very, very well. This is our lecture actually today that's being recorded on realism, the concept, and as you can see from our front page, that goes from 1850 to 1900. These are all some of the most famous realist image, and realism is really when photography actually gets born into our art vocabulary, which we have not had before. And with this, as we'll see during this kind of presentation, is that realism challenges individuals to think about really what reality is for the first time. For those of you who have seen The Matrix, is reality what you see? Is it what you feel? Is it your experience, or is it something outside of you? And the world had never really had to think about those concepts before. And so as you see in the black box right on the right-hand side, realism is really a combination of three things. It is a look for the picturesque. They're trying to still make images that are beautiful, that are resounding. We no longer have the Edmund Burke concept that we saw last time in Romanticism of this all mixed with fear. It really is much more picturesque. We have the birth of photography, and on the top of this, we have the reaction against industrial revolution. If you put those three concepts together, those ideas give us realism. And so the vast majority of the population is poor. We have gone through, or in the process of going through, the Industrial Revolution. So millions of uneducated individuals, because there's no free public education, are migrating to cities. Factory workers then that work in these slum communities, they're losing touch with nature. Remember, 50 years ago, everyone used to be an agrarian farmer. And so they actually saw nature on a daily basis. And now your world looks like this. It's dirty, it's poverty. You have the idea of factory and smoke and all the new diseases that are being developed within the process. And so landscape art, for the first time, this is eventually going to lead to Impressionism, is going to become very popular. And so on the left-hand side, you can see that is a photograph by one of the early great photojournalists, Jacob Riis. And that's a factory slum community in New York. And on the right-hand side, then, is the differences. Before the Industrial Revolution, you can see on the top image, everything had to be made by hand, which meant the nicest things went to the super wealthy within the process. When you look at the bottom image, then, that's now a middle-class home. So the middle class can now afford all sorts of different things, which they would have never been able to afford. They can live a higher quality life because of the industrialization. But because of that, it does mean that the people that are living in the slum communities are not going to be able to fully participate in this economy. This is still the capitalist economy that we live in today, where you have the middle class, which is what you ultimately want to expand so they can live the dream of kind of the upward mobility, the American dream we talk about. But the poor living on the left can't really afford to participate in that economy. So one of the things that shows up is that what is real? And so a great look at this is the Matrix scene on looking over our emails on our phone. I mean, it has been said that Google knows more information about you than your partner, because Google knows every keystroke you've ever made, or every email, if you're on Gmail, that you've ever sent. Even if you did not send the email, Gmail has already actually looked over it. It's how you get those pop-up ads that, hey, I was thinking about Cheerios, and then Cheerios actually show up in your next link on things to buy. They know more about you than they know if you've ever been on a porn site. They know every porn site you've been to. They know your preferences. They know everything you've actually ever shopped for, even for something else. So the question is, what is that matrix? Is that the internet or not? And that for the first time, that's what the realists are having to ask. It's a very good clip along those lines. And also, as a shout out as a movie professor, if you have never seen a science fiction movie, I highly recommend it. It's one of the best science fiction movies that's ever been done, called The Matrix. This video, which I won't show you here, is about 8 minutes long, but it makes the case for realism and why realism is still important today. So the birth of realism really comes out of the birth of photography, this new mechanical process that shows up. Up in the upper left-hand corner, is potentially as a quiz question that shows up, is the first photograph ever. So the upper left-hand corner is by Niepce, all the way on the left, Niepce from 1822. And it basically is a sun-drenched view outside of his window. Basically what a photograph is then is you are going to expose a particular chemical that changes from light to dark, or in color photography to a different color or different gradation based upon when sunlight is exposed. And so it's very close or very important in a early photography to keep everything dark within the process, so that when it does get exposed to light, only those particular light activated crystals show up. The first real main photographer besides Millet, who invents photography, who comes up with commercial photography, is all the way on the bottom. On your bottom left, that's Daguerre. And so many of you might have seen a daguerreotype without ever knowing about it. And so if you look right in the bottom underneath the photographic process, that is an actual picture of Edgar Allan Poe. And next to him is Abraham Lincoln. You'll note one of the things that they're very formulaic, and that is because the image that is right behind where I'm about to move myself, that is the chair that you used to have to sit in for a daguerreotype. Note it has neck clamps, and that is because it took 5 minutes to take a particular photo. So they asked you to blink as little as you possibly can. And so that's why the photos of Edgar Allan Poe really do make him look creepy, because he sat there for 5 minutes with no smile, no emotion. It's very hard to get that process across otherwise. Here is one of the hallmark, maybe the hallmark image that sets up all the standards that you could potentially know that you may or may not want to know from realism. So this is called The Stonebreakers by Gustave Courbet. So what I'd like you to do is that look all the way at the top. What are the features of realism based upon this artwork? And what you'll notice is for the first time we have a realistic poor subjects. We are heroicizing the dignity of work that shows up. These people are poor, but they're not being made fun of because of lack of education. It really is about the struggle of life within the process, kind of like what we saw with Raft and Medusa. It is super hyper detailed, which is going to lead us today to what we call hyper realism, things that are so real that even Pixar movies, you can't tell the difference between the water in Moana and a real wave, or the fur of the cat, the fur of the cat in the Pixar movie Toy Story 4 versus a real cat. You really can't tell the difference. We're going to put heroic subjects, these poor subjects, for the first time in monumental sizes, really showing how important their work is in every kind of capacity. And we're going to make hard manual labor look beautiful. Yes, it's hard manual labor, but it's the same as a king doing his job or a preacher doing his job that we've seen in early art history. So this is called The Stonebreakers. It is French, or by a French individual, which most of our artworks will be. So it's Gustave Courbet from 1848. This is really why we start dating realism from about 1850. It really does start here and then take off. The most famous realist of all time is Courbet. So he's the leader of realism. And here are a bunch of different images by him. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we've already talked about, or at least mentioned, the Stonebreakers. And the right is really a great, maybe the greatest depiction of an artist ever. That is Courbet. That is Desperate Man. It is a self-portrait. On the left, I have censored that because it is a very close-up image, which we'll see in a moment, of a vagina, just super realistic. But note, there's no head. It really is emphasizing just the vagina, the female origin. It's actually called Origins of the World. And in the right, then, Courbet himself became a celebrity. He was exiled from Paris in 1872 because, particularly, of images like the one on the left. He died of an alcoholic liver disease, and so we have that struggling hero artist, which you very much see in the Desperate Man portrait above. And so this is his image of his critics and his friends, where his critics are deriding and making fun of how terrible this is and how it really is not beautiful and picturesque like anything we've seen. Remember, because Romanticism and Neoclassicism are going on at the same time, where he has his friends on the right. His most famous quote, then, is right in the middle. I have always lived in freedom. Let me end my life free. When I am dead, let this be said of me. He belonged to no school, to no church, to no institution, to no academy, least of all to any regime except the regime of liberty. So he absolutely believed in the causes of Romanticism, just didn't particularly like their style with the exoticism, with the primitivism, with the idea of looking at the overwhelming all. He really wanted to look at the reality of situation, very much basically making paintings along the lines of what photography could do for the real everyday life. He just wanted to make a picturesque version of that in painting. Burial at Ornans, also by Courbet, from 1849 to 1950. He loved and derided both realism and impressionism. This is Courbet, even though he was very much a realist. He derided the realist label because he's doing what's slightly beyond reality. He's actually bringing you the real, but from his own experiences. This particular event records burial of his great uncle and models our funerary attendees. And he challenges the idea that monumental commoners and scale reserved for heroes. So if you look at the quote by Courbet all the way on the bottom, where I'm about to move my. So the burial of Ornans, this image here, is in truth the burial of Romanticism. Note it has stylistically many of the hallmarks of Romanticism. You've got that really dark tenebrism that came out of Baroque, which Romantics are going to use. We have people turning away from the scene. We have heroism for people who traditionally have not been heroes, gods, kings, chiefs, warriors. We have just an everyday individual that shows up, and it's on a monumental scale, showing that the death of this particular uncle was as important from the realist perspective as anything that would have happened to any of these other people in recent memory. It was a heroic struggle for life, and that's what the realists were looking at. So one of the things that shows up is that if you look at the upper left-hand corner, the Olympia by Manet, that is one of the most controversial images ever in the history of art. And the question we have to ask is why? Because if you look at the romantic image of nude Maja, 1799 to 1800 by Goya, that's a depiction of his wife. That was challenging. But if you look at the below, the Grand Odalisque by Ingres from 1814, or the Venus of Urbina from 1534 by Titian, we have had this long tradition of odalisques, very long tradition of odalisques, of naked female really shown up for pleasure. But note, in the Mannerist, it's a goddess, so it's okay. In the Grand Odalisque, we know she's a prostitute, but she's turning away. The romantic one, yeah, this is your wife, so on some level, it's our right. You shouldn't be showing it for other individuals. Thank you, Kanye, and all of his naked images of Kim Kardashian that break the internet that go out. And then Olympia, though, is different. And what's this one of the most controversial images in the history of art? Why so controversial? A lot of it has to do, what Manet says is, why lie? Why not tell the truth? Public was offended that she is not ashamed for being a prostitute. No, her eye gaze at you looks right at you. She's basically saying, next, and you are next in line. No one can hide. She's making eye contact with you. You have this brutality of harsh light when she should hide in the shadows. She's a prostitute. She's not ashamed about it. Her dog that we saw in Titian's is replaced with a pussycat, reference to the idea of the vaginal, and here you can see that black cat down here stretching out. Flowers as a gift from a client, probably from you who is next, basically buttering her up like you would a girlfriend. She's there for money, not for flowers. And on her hair, you'll notice she has an orchid in her hair. She got a bracelet, a pearl, earrings, and an oriental shawl. Ironically, on that bracelet that's on her arm, one of the things that's very weird is Manet himself had a lock of hair that his mom had that was on that bracelet. So that is a strange kind of feature that shows up. Make it of you will. But she is basically waiting for her next client. And so this caused a huge stir because it's calling into question. Remember, this is the age of syphilis from about 1850 to 1900. All the artists have syphilis. It's eventually going to kill Manet. And so Manet's dad, at the exact same time, had just gone through an adulterous affair. And so it could be a little bit of a self-reflection on his father, and his father was a well-renounced judge, and yet he was having this illicit sex affair on the side. So it might call out his father at the exact same time as being. At the Salon, then, one of the things that happens is they have large-scale portraits, and the Salon is run by the Academy. The Academy actually has very stylized versions of what they want to show. And so they'll say, this is our art style, and if you don't match our art style, you might make it in if you're slightly off kilter. But what they do is they try to embarrass you or hide that particular artwork by hanging it, higher and higher and higher. So whenever Courbet, who does get some images into different salons, shows his salon images or shows at the salon, he often is put in very high places because at this point, neoclassicism and romanticism are going to dominate. So you can see in this particular salon in particular, it's largely neoclassical patriotism, classical art that's being highlighted. And so the modernists, like Manet, like the realists, they were opposed to the academy system because it was sponsored by the government. The academies did do a good job in providing instruction for art students, but they exerted tight control. The salons rejected basically a lot of individual creativity. Van Gogh's not going to make it into a salon, for example. And the dissatisfaction with the academy's jurors established a new type of salon called the Salon des Refusés, from the Salon of the Rejected One from 1863. 3,000 rejective artworks from the main salon were actually put here. And two that actually were put on there, the two most famous ones, and this is the exhibit hall where it was Luncheon on the Grass, again, a Manet, and Symphony No. 1 by James McNeill Whistler, which we'll see later on in our course. You can note the compare and the contrast here is that it's not just men that are shown with this heroic from Stonebreakers on your right, it's the Gleaners by Millet. Women are showing doing this hard work. And gleaning, if you don't know, is even harder work than stone breaking, where you're breaking down these stones to make roads. You're basically making gravel from hand. The Gleaners is pretty amazing because note the women as they bend over, they're picking up individual grains of wheat. Just grains of wheat. They don't want to waste anything. Because if you look, the new reaper that had actually just been, the horse-drawn reaper, had just been invented, which you can see all the way in the back with a pile of hay right behind the woman on the left with the blue bandana over her head. If you look at that, she would basically pick up one piece of grain, would go for herself. The next piece of grain she picked up had to go to the person who ran it. So by the end of the day, each of these women would probably have enough pieces of grain to make a single loaf of bread. So their daily wages were basically grain that they would have to then go home and make to make a single loaf of bread. Think about it, if a loaf of bread is $3 or on sale $1.50 to $2, depending on where you shop and the quality of bread, that means her daily wage was $1.50 for backbreaking work that might take 12 hours. And of course, the problem with all of this is that the upper class had never seen these images before. Think about it. When's the last time, Donald Trump has been to very poor neighborhoods in Hialeah or in Overtown? I mean, when does that actually ever show up? It generally doesn't unless it's an election year. So they never see. And even when they do go into these places, the uber wealthy and the uber rich, the uber powerful, they're generally cleaned up. I remember when Bill Clinton came to Miami, when we held a program that was called the Clinton Global Initiatives University, which you applied for, we actually went and did a group cleanup day project in Hialeah. Before we ever went there, they cleaned up Hialeah. They had sent in, trucks that actually do sweeping of the streets. They had planted a couple extra trees. They made it look nicer even than Hialeah was before we ever showed up. And so when the photos showed up, it really was very kind of nice photos in different areas of Hialeah that are not necessarily always so nice. So this is something that happens. So the impact of realist artwork is that we start developing social programs. Because if you look at that kid in Stonebreakers, that kid is probably 14, maybe 12. That kid should be in school. And because that kid is not in school, there is no shot that that kid will ever be able to achieve, in this case, the French dream. But think about it as the American dream, upward mobility. It is not going to happen for that child. And because of that, the upper class were shamed. So they created the first laws on the books, which have to do with child labor. And that those laws ended up being 12 hours of work is the maximum that a child could work. They figured 12 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 4 hours of school, that would allow for upper mobility. That was our first law, and of course, it's going to be unsuccessful. The other thing that photography is going to challenge, and photographs, is photorealism. Photojournalism is going to develop. So here's an actual article, or a small short snippet of the article from the New York Times. The battlefield was stained with Confederate blood. More men were killed or wounded yesterday at the Battle of Antietam than on any other single day of the war. Our Federal losses were 12,410, while Confederate losses numbered 10,700. Although neither side gained a decisive victory, General Lee's failure to carry the war effort effectively into the North has caused Great Britain to postpone recognition of the Confederate government. This is the bloodiest, if you don't know, this is the bloodiest day in American history, at least to date, as of 2020. We lost 21,000 people in a single day, brother on brother, during the Civil War. The New York Times decided to run this particular ad, or this particular photo, for photojournalism, called Confederate Dead by Gardner and Brady, along with that article. And it shocked and terrified the American public. Because even though the New York Times, published in the North, was a Yankee paper, in the South and in the North where this gets distributed, people still thought these are our people. These are our individuals that show up. And so it's a 5-minute exposure time. That's why you can't see any action shots. So it's just the dead that are laid there that are actually going to be collected with their dog tags, but we couldn't identify. So the Civil War is where we developed dog tags, so we couldn't identify so many for burial and let their family, next of kin, know. And so people got so sick they threw up in their newspaper. So the only time in New York Times where they've actually apologized for publishing photos were these two. The one on the right is from 9/11, with individuals jumping off to their death, knowing that the building in the fire was going to fry them literally alive, or cook them alive, kill them. So they decided to commit. And the question is, was it even suicide? And the Confederate dead gathered for burial. So they do apologize because people literally threw up in their newspaper. The American public was not ready for it. So this birth of photojournalism comes out of Confederate dead, and it does challenge our nature of what war looks like, kind of like what Rubens did earlier with the consequences of war. If you look all the way on the right-hand side, then that is all the material that you would need. It was a 5-minute exposure time. There's the giant camera, but it took 2 wagons and 400 pounds of materials and chemicals in order to make one photograph on these giant glass plates. The question that comes up then is photography an art form, or is it just a mechanical process? And today we would say, oh yes, photography absolutely is an art form. In 1860, remember, this is 40 years, 4 decades after photography had developed that first photograph, going all the way back to the sun-drenched light of Niepce. Is that because anyone can create a photo? What is the difference between art and science? A mechanical process. You're manipulating it. And so certain artists, such as Two Walks of Life by Oscar Rylander, that lower right hand, where he put vices and sin on one side, virtue and work on the other. He uses 30 different negatives and said, yes, photography is an art form, or can be an art form, not always an art form. So they're actually having this conversation of what reality is, even in terms of, is it science or is it art? Just like the Matrix asked that question. Another individual who challenges us with this is Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge basically took serial photographs. And he has a 24 camera setup, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, whereas the horse gallops or as the bird flies by, every 1/24th of a second or every 1/10th of a second, however he sets it up, it takes a photograph. And so you get full motion, because if you look at the frame of what's called the persistence of vision, he's basically inventing very early motion picture, very, very early, because your eye can only comprehend an image, and it holds in your mind for between 1/10th to about 1/30th of a second. And so as it holds it in your mind, the next image pops up. So you actually perceive motion. Because of this, we learn, if you look at the way the horse is moving, or the horse is still but slightly moving in those 24 different images, it's the birth of animation today. So when you put them all together, here's what they're still a little clunky, but you can actually see how things are moving. They were actually looking how motion really worked. And this is going to give us a much richer, realistic look at the world. It's also going to give us film. So if you look today, this is how we can do the Matrix stop motion scene. Nude descending a staircase, an image which you have not seen yet, is going to come out, which basically is taking that and making it looking at like a mechanical process. The carousel animation of whether that's Dr. Seuss or Disney later on. Bodies in motion from Muybridge, where you have multiple different images of the same body moving at the same time, by Sir Francis Bacon. These are all going to be outpourings of Muybridge and photography that's going to continue on all the way into our world. The most famous early photographer to actually claim that photography is an art form is going to be this individual here, Alfred Stieglitz. He promotes photography as an art form, and he's probably the most important American artist during this time period. He does end up marrying and falling in love with Georgia O'Keeffe, one of the most famous female artists that we have in the 20th century. And now we even want to get rid of the female and say one of the most famous artists of the 20th century. 8 of the 9 highest priced photos, when we adjust for inflation, are still Stieglitz photos. 2 of them are here. The one on the left is steerage, immigrants coming into the New World and into our world. And on the right, Winter, Fifth Avenue. For any of you who love Martin Scorsese and who have seen Gangs of New York, you've seen that photo on the left, steerage. It's actually in the Gangs of New York. And the basis of that particular scene from the Gangs of New York, where the immigrants come in, Leonardo DiCaprio dismounts, and they have a beautiful pan shot that shows up there. And Alfred Stieglitz, like a lot of these early artists, then suffered from mental health issues. He suffered specifically from depression. And so trying to capture this beautiful aspect, because where you show the camera, he's arguing, and how you develop it, whether you get a soft focus like on the right for the snowstorm to kind of etherealizes what's taking place, or very hard cutting edge on the left showing an actual event. You chose that scene. You could have chosen that scene 4 feet over, 5 feet over. You could have just chosen the people getting off. But here you're showing the people all the way as they're looking to get off of a boat as it comes in, kind of the anticipation of what's about to happen. The other individuals that's actually absolutely promoting the wonderful use of photography as an art form is one of the most famous photographers of all time. And without him, we probably do not have a National Park Service, is Ansel Adams, who lived from 1902 all the way now. Look, we're getting very close to the present day, until 1984. The reason he started making photography is that when he was 12 years old, his family was going to take a vacation to Yosemite, and they wanted to make sure that their 12-year-old son was not bored. And so they bought him a very cheap camera, and that's how he actually started making photos of Yosemite, which brings him back and forth. If you don't know, Yosemite, beautiful national park, about 2 hours outside of San Francisco. He's basically going to create what's called the zone system for deep focus photography. And that is, if you want to have everything in focus. So you'll note that in the middle image, the mountains in the back are in focus. The clouds are in focus. The trees in the middle ground with the bending, that beautiful bending of the river is in focus. And the foreground is focused. So we came up with the zone system on how to take photographs for both the foreground, the middle ground, and the background to try to keep everything in focus. So you get this very deep, rich photography, which we now see in almost all of our films in the modern day world. When we show an overview or an establishing shot of a film, we want to show the beauty of nature everywhere. And then later on, we're going to concentrate just on the character right here, and everything will be blurry in the background because the character is the most important aspect of what happens to be there. And so that soft photography that shows up. And so his photos were used to help justify creation of our national park system. He's one of the few artists ever to win the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That's the highest honor that a civilian can win in the United States of America. And that was given to him by President Ronald Reagan. Another very early artistic photographer, Edward Weston, basically is looking at both the bending of the female form, as you can see, the lower part in the buttock of the woman in the middle section, but then is looking at these very close-up, organic, moving shapes that almost look like body parts, but are often or almost always these beautiful light and dark contrasts on different fruits, on vegetables, on rocks that shows up. He was considered the most innovative American photographer, and you can see his work relies heavily, and her work relies heavily on the work of Georgia O'Keeffe, who's doing it in a painting style as well. So the two of these are actually very good friends. You could start off, you can actually see his early photographs are interesting because that's a self-portrait of him in the upper left-hand corner. And he's got early soft focus pictorialism, which really does look very kind of picturesque versus the hard-edged, beautiful shapes that show up from his vegetables, his plants, his female body. He was the first Guggenheim photographer. And so he actually worked with Peggy Guggenheim, who's the founder of the Guggenheim Museum, to come up with a photography section. And so it largely was his ideas on photography that actually get promoted as we promote art as photography here in the United States of America. And so later on, you can see he's really the person who's going to promote this beautiful hyper-realism that shows up in photography, in film, and in other art forms today. Now, one of the interesting things that happened is that photography lasts until 1900 in the rest of the world, but not in America. In America, we get addicted to realism. We love it. because we use realism then to talk about how we're different than the rest of the world, that we were Puritans that have this huge work ethic, that we have this Wild West, that we have this outdoor love of nature that shows up, that we call it almost this idea of creation of Americana. And what we do is Winslow Homer is largely responsible for the first part of this, where we literally are creating and looking at how awesome we are as a civilization. And so if you look at these beautiful images, particularly the one on the bottom, it's a children's game that they're looking at. I'll move myself out of it, called Snap the Whip. Today we've outlawed it almost everywhere because if you snap the whip, you're probably going to break the kid's hands. Kids run with their arms kind of out like this, and then the one other child tries to run through and break your arms apart. You can either clothesline the child and hurt them, so that person could get hurt, or you could break an arm as people hold on or sprain. So we've actually outlawed. But this is what children used to play during recess. You can see the red schoolhouse in the background. You know, one room building for all grades. That was kind of Americana, who we were. Norman Rockwell is going to condition on this and really is probably responsible more than anyone else for our Americana. You've probably seen most of these images. I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus, the song based upon this in the upper left-hand corner. The cop with the kid who's running away, here right in the middle. The idea of the Red Sox and baseball's Americana. The turkey dinner with grandparents putting everything out that we see multiple spoofs of. Disney and Mickey, which is a spoof of the self-portrait of Norman Rockwell. We are talking about how pure and how innocent, basically all the way until 1950s America. This is what we're looking at. So we are going to love realism. Now, Europe and the rest of the world, they moved past this realism in 1900. So we continue on realism all the way until World War II. Basically, World War II kicks us out of it. But in the meantime, Europe goes through, think about how radically different these are if you know what these movements are. They're going to look at Fauvism, multiple uses of color in Gauguin, and primitivism. They're going to look at Cubism, Dada, art about nothing, Surrealism about sex and science, abstract expressionism and abstraction where anything can be art and start to challenge us. We're still making Americana, and so the rest of the world sees us as a backward, backwater, kind of very conservative art movement within the process. And so as we think through this, not just in an American perspective, but in other perspectives, what are the 5 most influential photographs of all time? Can any of you think of what those might be? And it says Migrant Mother. Here they are. The ones that we most, and really there's 6 that show up. So we have one that actually got us out of Vietnam. We actually had carpet bombed, basically dropped a number of bombs on a village, thinking that there were Viet Cong that happened to be there. And what we found is that the people that were running out of that village, and this has really changed the war when this got published in Time Life magazine, people that got blown up, they were women and children. And we had to question, what are we doing in another part of the world? Yes, it was about communism and stopping the spread of communism, but look at the people that we were hurting, including that child in the middle who later died. Basically, her flesh is melting off with boils and rashes. And it basically shamed the United States. What are we doing? This is not who we are, right? We had Americana before this. The one in the middle one up here, that is the building right here where my cursor is. That is the building of the Empire State Building with people just having lunch up on, which you've seen multiple spoofs on. This one, right before the beginning of your life, about 20 years old, is the Tiananmen Square massacre that took place in China, where those tanks rolled up on an individual who basically was standing there playing Beethoven, asking for some aspect of freedom in a communist nation. We have the moon, the idea, or the image of the Earth from the moon from 1969, the lunar space landing, which took place twice. We have the beginning of the atomic bomb and kind of how that ended World War II. And then note the very end of World War II with the sailor kissing the girl in the middle of Times Square. So as we think about realism in the United States going past 1900, we have to set the stage. What's going on in America during the 1920s and 1930s? This is American Gothic from 1930 by Grant Wood. And what's going on is we have this period that's called the Great Dust Bowl. And then we have the Great Depression, which is about to, and you can see the images of the food lines in front. The Great Dust Bowl, if you don't know, we have some of the the most agriculturally rich lands to grow agricultural corn, wheat, crops in the entire world, right in the middle part of the United States of America. Places where no one goes, but it's our farming belt. That would be Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, the wheat fields going all the way into Colorado. We have Indiana, we have Illinois within those contexts for corn. That land had been so overcropped that we basically were creating a dust. And so when we had a drought and the ground dried up, all that rich nutrient agricultural land blew across the United States and basically eventually in the ocean. So for a number of years, we could not grow crops like we could. And ironically, it happened at the same time as the Great Depression. And so the Great Depression, when the stock market crashed, was October 29th, 1919, or 1929, October 29th, 2029. When that crashed, we had literally millions of people that weren't employed. The unemployment, if you remember from your own lifetime, the unemployment in the little mini depression that we had about 15 years ago, where we got up to about 8 to 11% unemployment, depending upon where you lived, the locality. The unemployment during the Great Depression was nearly 30%. We didn't have all those social networks. Remember, realism is just developing. And so the reason that you get so little of your paycheck today is because of the Great Depression. Why? Because if you ever lose your job, you can get unemployment. That did not exist then. We have Social Security for your retirement. None of that actually exists until afterwards. Like, we need to help people learn to save and then balance their budget so they have something they can do so they can retire in the future. So here's the question of the reality of American Gothic. On the left, that is an actual house that still exists today. That is the house from American Gothic. On the lower left-hand corner, that is the two individuals. It's his sister and his dentist who were the models for this particular artwork. In front of the artwork, it's in Chicago. And so the question becomes then, is this a positive or a negative depiction of American life if you just look at the image itself? And so it largely comes down to, are we looking at the emotion or are we looking at the conditions? Because the house and everything is in gorgeous shape, particularly for someone going through both the Depression as well as the Dust Bowl. But if you look at the emotion, particularly on the female's face, she's not happy. We can't tell the age difference, so we don't even know within the image, is this supposed to be a married couple? Is this a father protecting his daughter with a pitchfork right in front of him? We just can't tell those things. It's one of the most accurate, one of the most spoofed artworks in American history, whether it's Miss Piggy and Kermit, Barbie, going all the way Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, Big Bang Theory, Star Wars up in the upper left-hand corner, gay marriage in the lower right corner. And this artwork then is also in the Art Institute of Chicago, and it is the same thing. This was done in 1942 by Edward Hopper, who generally does isolationist landscapes. And that's because Edward Hopper says, hey, there's a great thing that goes on with America. We have upward mobility that allows you to go and do whatever you want. You have freedom here like you have almost nowhere else in the world. He said, with that freedom comes with the cost. And that freedom might come with the cost of isolationism. I mean, think about all the Facebook friends that probably many of you have. Many of you probably have 1,000 different contacts on Facebook. How many of those people would help you move? If you got into a trouble and got cancer or sick, how many of those people would come visit you in the hospital? How many of those people would stand up if you got unemployed and buy you a meal or feed you within the, and the question is, are we really just fooling ourselves into believing that we have friends, or do we really truly have friends? That's what this artwork is asking. I mean, imagine these two people over there on the right-hand side, the woman in the red, the man sitting next to them. Note how their hands move close to them. They're clearly on a date, probably in the middle of the night. And yet that date's not particularly going well. They're no different than the individual slouched over on the other side. Note the soda jerk, the individual working in the white costume, doesn't look at anyone. He's not making eye contact with anyone. And how do they get out? There's no door. And so they're almost locked in like animals. The soda jerk can get out. He's got a cafe, a door behind him he can get out of. But everyone else is kind of locked in, almost like they're caged animals. Remember, this is done right in the aftermath of World War II. So we're going to have this isolationist. Even, I mean, there's no lights on. And this is New York City, the city supposedly that never sleeps. So a really interesting curating thing. And so if you ever work in a museum, here are some of the decisions you get to make. The Art Institute of Chicago owns both of these and has curated them to face each other. So the question I'm going to ask and have you think about, is this a smart curation? Because it's basically saying they're having a dialogue over time. One is from 1930, the American Gothic. The other one is from 1942. And so one is about isolation. The other one is about what's going on in the Great Dust Bowl, about 12 years apart, that actually ironically got us out of the Great Depression. It lasted that long. And so is this a smart curation, or should they be on their own? I'll give you a moment to ponder that as you think about some of the great spoofs for this particular artwork as well. Now, realism today continues on. So we have contemporary photographer, this is Spencer Tunick from 1967. He's still living today. And so what he basically does is he uses the model of the human body as brushstrokes. So he asks people to do it fully out of the goodness of their heart, to pose naked for his lovely images that show up all over around the world. And that's what we have here. And so sometimes he'll get 10,000 people to show up naked. And on the bottom right hand, even on a Swiss glacier. In the upper left hand, that's outside in Sydney, the Opera House in Sydney. Sometimes they're colored, but this is a new recent phenomenon. And note the one on the upper left-hand side, that was in Miami Beach. So, and the question is, would you be willing to pose? What many people say is that for who particularly who have not made art before, that this is one of the most freeing artistic experiences they've ever had. And he has multiple couples now that have actually got married by meeting on these naked extravaganzas. They've never arrested any of the people that are naked, no matter where they are. They have arrested him for a number of times. And now he's starting to do individual portraits that have gone through trauma. So the individual on the right is a South African man, 72-year-old man that was actually jailed with Mandela for black rights, who actually got out of prison. Now, first off, I want that guy to be my grandpa, because look, he's ripped. He's actually not afraid. He said it's the most freeing thing he's ever done after being in prison fighting against apartheid in South Africa. One of the other things I want to actually point out, is, as much as I can, is to show you different art careers that show up. So here's an art career that many of you may have never thought of. It's called illustration. And illustration starting salary somewhere around $40,000, $45,000. They can make up to $100,000. And there's different types of illustration you can do. You can do children's illustration, such as the Lorax and for kids' books that show up. You can do directions illustration. Here's the Billy from IKEA. Mechanical illustration on how things function for individuals to understand. You can do arts illustration. You could do anatomical illustration, biological illustration, map illustration, and scientific illustration. All these are different parts. And so there's a number of different jobs that are out there. It generally requires a master's or an MFA in drawing, or a BFA at the minimum with lots of drawing. Another realist photographer that shows up, and it's interesting to call this realism, is Chuck Close. Chuck Close suffers from cognitive issue with recognizing faces. And so the image all the way on the right, to show you how powerful this has become, that is the actual national portrait. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. of presidents, it's a Chuck Close of Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, all the way on the right-hand side. And so he actually uses fractals, or tiny little distortions, and uses a computer to help him actually see variations in color and shape. And so he's using the realist element, even though it doesn't look realist at all. It's basically the next thing. How do your eyes actually work? Kind of like Impressionism, to show a realistic image. We have modern day auteur realist filmmakers like Steven Spielberg, whether that's him actually, he won the Academy Award for Lincoln. He also won the Academy Award for Schindler's List, and the Academy Award, of course, for Saving Private Ryan, which all deal with the reality of the situation in the world, trying to put you in a been there, feel like atmosphere. And so that is it for realism. It's an overview really of how we actually look and experience reality, and how we feel within the process of reality, whether that's starting off with photography, moving all the way into where we still have reality today, particularly in modern day filmmaking. Gangster rap largely deals with modern day realism as well, and urban Black poor communities in particular. So I hope everything is going well. If you have any questions, let me know, and have a wonderful day. Bye.